Trans people woke up to find that their license had been invalidated overnight, forcing them to make emergency plans to go to the DMV and putting them at risk of getting pulled over and even receiving jail time. In one staggering example, a trans woman who didn't even change her gender marker still found that her license was invalidated. The fact that she had never even changed her gender on her license to begin with shows that this law isn't just targeting people who changed their gender on their official government ID. The state is targeting all trans people and even compiling a list of them. It's a dystopian policy that harkens back to exactly what the Nazis did to trans people and eventually Jewish people in Germany. But trans people and their allies are fighting back. This story has attracted a lot of attention in recent days, and it's no surprise given the gravity and the consequences at stake here. But it's also important to note that independent and local media have been leading the charge, especially independent trans led media organizations like Aaron Reed's Substack. Aaron Reed, who runs the Substack Aaron in the Morning, was the first person to publish an example of these letters that were being sent out to trans Kansans. And now assignedmedia.org has broken this story about a woman who had to surrender her license even though she never changed her gender marker. Essentially, she had a license with her new name, but it still contained the gender marker M because she was afraid of something like this happening, but it happened to her anyways. Andrea Ellis, a trans woman who lives in Wellington, Kansas, received this letter to her utmost surprise since she had never changed her gender marker to begin with. According to Assigned Media, she last updated her driver's license on January 7th, 2026, after completing a legal name change in December 2025. But she held off from changing her gender marker because of discussions that were happening in the Republican legislature at the time. She told Assigned Media, "I saw the writing on the wall after listening to Attorney General Kobach's testimony." But despite taking this precaution, she still received a letter in the mail on February 25th telling her that her license was invalid. That Thursday morning, she drove over 30 minutes to the nearest DMV where she could get a new license. To do so, she had to break the law and risked being pulled over, but it was the only way she could get herself to the DMV. That's one of the most obviously malicious aspects of this legislation is that trans people lost access to their IDs immediately, meaning that they had to get themselves to the DMV in a rural state where most people have to drive to get anywhere. Assuming that they didn't have anyone to drive them, they were essentially forced to break the law in order to comply. This put them at risk of getting pulled over and even facing jail time. And Kansas houses inmates according to their sex assigned at birth, which means that, for example, a trans woman could be sent to a men's prison where she would face systemic sexual assault and be forced to detransition. Fortunately, Assigned Media reported that Ellis arrived at the DMV with no issues. Once she got there, she presented the letter to, quote, a confused employee. And she said, "It seemed like none of the DMV staff had any idea what was going on. I don't think there was time for them to have any training on how to handle this stuff." She was then given a paper license with her original license revoked, but both of them essentially said the exact same thing and both contained the gender marker M. Ellis then left the DMV only to receive a call a few hours later that she needed to come back. She told Assigned Media, "They didn't tell me what the problem was, but I overheard them saying there was a quote flag tied to my ID in their system that they had to remove." So she went back to the DMV and was issued a second replacement that again said the exact same thing. Assigned Media founder Evan Urquhart posted this on Blue Sky, saying, "What's scary about this story is the surveillance it hints at. This trans woman had changed her name legally, but chose not to change her gender marker. She was apparently flagged in the DMV system as trans, and her license was invalidated under a law that supposedly only concerned gender markers. The idea that women and children are unsafe because trans people can have a driver's license that reflects their gender is nonsensical. It's trans people who were already unsafe and who are being made significantly more unsafe as a result of this new law. And although it might seem insignificant, that little letter on your driver's license, this is a big deal for trans people in day-to-day interactions. Whenever they have to show their license to somebody, a bouncer at a bar, a government official, a receptionist at a doctor's office, the list goes on, they can be confronted over their appearance not matching what that letter says. Harper Seldon, a senior staff attorney for the ACLU's LGBTQ and HIV rights project, talked about this in a news release. The ACLU is now challenging this law in court. But as Seldon said, it's a cruel and craven threat to public safety, all in the name of fostering fear, division, and paranoia. Specifically, the invalidation of state issued IDs threatens to out transgender people against their will every time they apply for a job, rent an apartment, or interact with police. Taken as a whole, it's a transparent attempt to deny transgender people autonomy over their own identities and push them out of public life altogether. Now, Marissa Kabas, another independent journalist, spoke to several trans Kansans about how this law has already impacted them. One person Marissa spoke to, Zoe, said, "I'm definitely not a fan of being marked as a trans person in a state database. I worry that the presidential administration could start going after us with that information, like they already have for immigrants." Other people Marissa spoke to worried that this could affect trans people's ability to vote. Marissa obtained an email that was sent to DMV employees in Kansas about this change that indicated the original letter had been sent to about 300 license holders in the state. That means that Kansas Republicans are going to an extreme amount of effort, including a legislative bait and switch, all to go after just a few hundred constituents who pose no outsized threat to their community and, in fact, are extremely vulnerable to what's happening now, state abuses of power that put them and their lives at risk. Trans people have been one of the most vulnerable minority groups throughout history, harkening back to the Nazi Party, who initially went after trans people as one of the first minorities targeted under Hitler. Nazis burned libraries of material about trans and gender nonconforming people before they moved on to targeting other minorities in Germany, like Jewish people. The exact same thing is happening under the Trump administration now, down to the use of these markers on people's IDs that they have to carry with them at all time. The state is literally compiling a list of trans people, which should terrify everybody. Just days after this legislation went into effect, the ACLU backed a lawsuit against the state filed by two trans residents of Kansas. This lawsuit challenges the new law, saying it targets transgender Kansans across multiple unrelated domains of their lives. Going on to say, this sweeping law restricts trans individuals from obtaining driver's licenses reflecting their gender identity and bans trans people from accessing restrooms or other single sex spaces in a range of public places, including libraries, courthouses, state parks, hospitals, and interstate rest stops. Its restrictions extend beyond just government buildings, applying also to buildings owned by or leased from the government, even if they are controlled by private entities. By targeting trans Kansans, the act violates the Kansas Constitution's guarantees of personal autonomy, privacy, equality under the law, due process, and free expression. It also violates the Kansas Constitution's single subject and clear title requirements. In addition to revoking trans people's licenses and barring them from bathrooms, this law also creates an incentive for other Kansans to patrol their neighbors and report them to the state on the belief that they are transgender. It even institutes a bounty reward for rewarding trans people who are using the wrong bathroom. And although the law is blatantly unconstitutional and will likely eventually be struck down, it's already affecting trans people in Kansas today. It sets a horrifying precedent and is part of a patchwork of laws around the US, all meant to discriminate against trans people, force them out of public life, and ultimately disincentivize people from coming out as trans in the first place. The conversation reports that the number of bills directly targeting and undermining the existing legal rights of trans and non binary people in the US has been escalating, with sharp increases since 2021 and with each consecutive year. This, they say, is the most radical blow yet. The conversation continues on by mandating the use of birth assigned sex on identity documents. Kansas denies trans people legal recognition and curtails their freedom of movement. These laws open the door to an even wider range of discriminatory policies. And as this goes on to note, invalidating someone's ID has immediate and powerful consequences that cascade into all aspects of their life. For example, without a valid driver's license, many trans and non binary people will be unable to get to work, attend classes, pick up their children, visit the doctor, see friends, or even go to the grocery store. Trans and non binary people who need to drive with an invalid license risk fines and jail time, where, like I said, they would be housed according to their sex assigned at birth, which in effect would force trans people to detransition and also expose them to systemic sexual abuse that we know affects trans people housed in jail in this way. But the conversation continues. They write that trans and non binary people who have not updated their IDs are more likely to experience psychological distress and suicidality, in part due to increased day to day stress. Things we already discussed, like having to prove to a receptionist at a doctor's office that you really are who you say you are. This would be stressful for anybody, but it's compounded by the fact that trans people routinely face harassment, discrimination, and other forms of violence, as well as the fact that their identities are routinely invalidated and they're told that they don't have autonomy over their lives, bodies, and choices. On a very basic level, this type of law makes no sense, especially for trans people who have been living out and proud for years already. A lot of trans men have things like facial hair. A lot of trans people are passing as the gender they identify with. So if they're being forced to use a different bathroom, they're actually going to stand out and cause even more confusion. The same people who view it as a risk to have a trans woman in a bathroom with cis women apparently think it's okay for a trans man with a full beard to be in that space. But the hypocrisy is actually the point, because the reality is the desire behind these laws is for trans people to cease to exist in public at all. They don't want to see trans people in any public restroom. They don't want to see trans people in any public space. They don't want to see trans people, period. And even as an extremely small minority of people, that's too much for these transphobic Republicans. They want to eradicate trans people, which has never been clearer. And it's that type of sentiment that leads to discrimination and escalating violence and can even result in things like genocide. We've already seen things like this happen, with Nazi Germany being perhaps the most relevant example here. But in the meantime, a lot of trans people in Kansas aren't going anywhere. Some have already made plans to flee or have already fled the state, but not everyone has that ability. And for people like Abby Boatman, Kansas's sole trans representative, leaving just simply isn't an option. In an op-ed for MS Now, Abby Boatman wrote about her years of public service, including serving in the military. And the way that she ended her piece is as follows. She wrote, "Since my transition, many people have asked me why I don't move to a state where I can continue public service and be treated with more dignity. For more than a decade, my answer has always been the same. The work is here. Kansas is a beautiful state. Kansas is my home, and we have a lot of good things going for us. So I'm staying here to defend the freedom of all Kansans, whether the majority party likes it or not." It's a strong statement, and it's heartening to see representatives like Abby Boatman, organizations like the ACLU, and trans journalists rally together to fight for the rights of not just trans people in Kansas, but ultimately everyone, to live free from government surveillance and have autonomy over our own lives and identities. But the reality is, trans people cannot do this alone. Their neighbors, cis allies, need to step up and speak out about this threat to trans people, not just in Kansas, but everywhere. It's great to see how much attention this issue has gotten and the outrage that it provokes. We need to keep that up, because if Kansas Republicans are able to get away with this, there's no telling what extremes they'll take it to next.